Hey everyone, my name is Harry, and the title for my talk today is Strategies for Using React Native in a Brownfield Application. So the agenda for my talk looks like this. I'm going to start off by giving you some background information. I'm going to explain terminology that I'm going to be using throughout my talk today, such as what is a Greenfield React Native application and what is a Brownfield React Native application. I'm then going to move on to a section entitled, Should I Do This? In this section, I'm going to talk about why Brownfield React Native development is particularly challenging, and I'm going to give you some criteria that you can use to decide if Brownfield React Native is a good fit for you or the organization that you might be part of. I'm then going to move on to a section entitled, How Do I Do This? Now in this section, I have open sourced a Brownfield React Native example application that's based on some work that I did for one of my clients in San Francisco, a privacy startup by the name of KeepSafe. I'm going to go through the architecture of this application, and I'm going to discuss a strategy and a process that you can use if you decide to do a Brownfield React Native integration within your app or your company. So what is Greenfield React Native development? Well, a Greenfield React Native app is one that was created from scratch using React Native. What is a Brownfield React Native app? A Brownfield React Native app uses React Native to power one or more views or user flows within an existing native application. So you have an existing native iOS or Android application, and you want to take React Native and stick it into it and use it to power a part of that application. So should you do this? Should you attempt to integrate React Native into an existing application? Well, before I attempt to answer that question, I want you all to take a step back and imagine that someone who is a lay, non-technical user, someone who's not a software engineer, went up to you and asked you a question. They might say, hey Mike, what is the point of React Native? Why are you so excited about this and are hosting conferences and doing all of this sort of stuff? Well, there are many ways that you can answer this question, but the way that I would answer this question is I would say that React Native allows me, as a software engineer, to do more with less. If I was to sit down with this person and I was to list out the pros of React Native, I would say the following. React Native allows one engineer to write code for the web and mobile. React Native allows you to take a single code base and have it produce an iOS and an Android application with minimal changes. React Native allows you to have a faster development cycle. Unlike Android and iOS, you don't have to wait to compile to see the changes that you've made to your source code show up in the device that you're targeting. So in theory, React Native allows your front-end engineers to be 2 to 3 times as productive as they normally would be. So why is a Brownfield integration harder than doing a Greenfield React Native application? Well, let's think about and contrast the things that you would need to know if you were creating a Greenfield React Native application on your own to if you were integrating React Native into an existing application. Well, in order to do a Greenfield React Native app, you obviously need to know JavaScript, you need to know how React works, and you also need to know how to use React Native. So what would you need to know to do a Brownfield integration if you were doing it on your own? Well, you'd need to know JavaScript, you'd need to know how React works, and you'd also need to know how to use React Native. But that's not all. You'd probably need to know at least one native programming language. So if this was iOS, that would obviously be Swift or Objective-C. If this was Android, that might be Kotlin or it could be Java. But you also need to know how the native platform's APIs work. So if you're targeting an iOS platform, you would need to know how view controllers work, and you'd probably need to know a little bit about the app delegate. If this is Android, you'd want to know about activities and fragments. But you'd also need to know about the platform's ecosystem and toolchain. For example, if you want to install a third-party library with React or React Native, right, you'd use npm and yarn, and that would cause your package.json file to change. Well, on iOS alone, there are a number of different ways to install third-party libraries. You might use Carthage, you might use CocoaPods. If you're using CocoaPods, you're going to want to modify a pod file. And if you're installing a third-party library, this is going to have consequences depending on whether that third-party library uses Swift or Objective-C and whether your application is set up to use a certain version of Swift or not. These are all things that you might need to think about if you're doing a Brownfield integration. Often, if you're doing a brownfield integration, you didn't write the original application yourself. You're inheriting a new native code base. So you need to become familiar with how that code base is architected in order to integrate React Native into it successfully. But that's not all. So I have done development for a number of different platforms over the years. I started off doing cross-platform desktop, then I did native Android, then I did native iOS, and then today I do a lot of React Native work. As a rule of thumb, it takes me about 1 to 3 months to learn the ins and outs of a new platform, best practices, patterns, and all that kind of stuff. Well, with a brownfield integration, you potentially have 2 brand new platforms that are very different that you have to learn. Any existing code base takes time to learn. Whether you're a contractor or whether you're a full-time employee starting a new job, it takes you a while to get your bearings in a code base. With a brownfield integration, you potentially have 2 new code bases that you need to know how to learn. So initially, a brownfield integration is probably going to be at least 2 to 3 times as hard as doing a greenfield React Native application from scratch. In other words, a brownfield integration potentially nullifies many of the advantages of React Native. So why do a brownfield integration at all? Well, there are many ways to look at choices in technology. One way is to take the perspective of a business and look at tools like React Native through the lens of return on investment. So as software engineers, the investment that we make is the time it takes us to learn a tool. The return is what that tool enables you to do. A positive ROI should, in the long run, either save time or increase the pace of development for you or the organization that you happen to be part of. For an individual who does not know React Native already, using React Native in an existing native app is probably a bad investment. So who would a brownfield integration be a good investment for? Organizations. What types of organizations? I would say as the number of engineers working on any app grows, an investment in infrastructure is usually required to maintain the pace of development. So examples of infrastructure investments that organizations and individuals might make are things like optimizing build times, continuous integration, the use of linters, or using GraphQL or a different data store. React Native is just another piece of infrastructure. So which organization should try a brownfield integration? Well, using React Native in a brownfield app is probably best suited for larger organizations. It's an expensive piece of infrastructure for the reasons I just listed before. So ideally, these organizations would have multiple teams working on the same app for multiple platforms. Ideally, an organization that already has a web team that uses React. React Native, in theory, can help the organizations I just described be more efficient. The cost of learning can be paralyzed by having multiple people work on the project at the same time. So imagine an organization where you have native iOS and Android engineers. They could come in parallel and build out the React Native integration in their apps in such a way that the web team, who are React developers, could come in, do the UI and business logic without having to become iOS or Android experts. Adopting any new piece of infrastructure can result in failure if you choose the wrong project at the wrong time. This isn't just a brownfield React Native thing. Let's think about a scenario. Let's say that you're engineers working on a mobile application and you're on a sprint trying to introduce a new feature on a tight deadline. The feature is going well, but the last couple of days of the project, you've been reading a bunch of stuff on Hacker News and you decide, hey, I want to swap out the database in my iOS application. You know, I've been reading about this Realm thing. It seems really cool. I'm going to swap out core data from Realm. Well, that's a very invasive and risky thing to do, and it could potentially either slip the release or destabilize the application after release. And other people in your organization might get annoyed at you for doing this, and they might get annoyed at Realm. But that is nothing to do with the quality of Realm as a database. You just chose the wrong project at the wrong time to adopt that piece of technology. So the key takeaway here is it's important to choose the right project to showcase the strengths of React Native if you do decide to adopt it within your organization. So how do you pick the right project for a brownfield integration? Well, I do a lot of consulting and contracting in San Francisco, and I work with many different companies. Some of these companies have been considering doing brownfield integrations. And from my experience, and and looking at a lot of the blog posts that have been written about Brownfield React Native, there was one in particular that really resonated with me. And this blog post was written by the co-founder of Expo, Mr. Charlie Cheever, and it was entitled, "Should We Use React Native?" So the context for this quote that I'm going to read you is, of course, Brownfield React Native. So Charlie has the following to say: if you're thinking of using React Native for a few things, like a settings screen, an FAQ, or something like an about page, the kind of thing where you would normally just stick a web view, you're likely to have good luck. I think this is a really good piece of advice. If you're doing a Brownfield React Native integration, you should start with something simple and easy to do to build confidence. Charlie goes on to give a little bit of a warning, though. There are people who identify themselves strongly as iOS or Android programmers and have a really hard time being happy with React Native. iOS programmers in particular are very unhappy with it and generally regard JS as an infestation of the company's code base. Very strong words, Charlie. But I think I should give some historical context to this because I've been doing mobile development since about like 2010. And when I started doing mobile development, the state of JavaScript was not the awesome place that it is in today. No, the state of JavaScript, if you were doing a mobile application, was a hybrid mobile web app that was usually not that performant, and you would usually have to deal with this big mess of jQuery that the front-end team had cooked up to support all sorts of crazy versions of Safari or Internet Explorer. We didn't really have transpilers and a lot of the things like React that make modern web development really, really awesome. A consequence of that is people like me, who would have done native development and had to deal with this back in the day, absolutely hate JavaScript-based mobile applications and are very suspicious of technologies like React Native. So luckily for you all, I actually gave a talk on this team to an iOS developers conference last year in Germany. The title of this talk is An iOS Developer's Take on React Native, and it's designed to explain to native engineers how React works and why it's different from things like Cordova. I talk about transpilers, I talk about Flow, Yoga Layout, all of these things that have kind of come along to make React and React Native a really great experience for developers today. And this might help you in the context of an organization at selling this technology and convincing some of the native developers that you're working on that, hey, this React Native thing isn't totally a terrible idea. So Charlie goes on to say some more. He says, even if you're using React Native for things that it's good at and having success, it can still be hard for large-scale native and React Native development to coexist in the same organization for non-technical reasons. Again, if it's your own project and you're deciding to learn about React Native by integrating it into it, no problem. That's your time. But when you're in a larger organization, the infrastructure decisions that you make have impact on other teams and other people's careers. And you need to be mindful of this and think about that when you're introducing new technologies into a stack. So, if you want infrastructure to be widely adopted, it is important to build trust in both you and the infrastructure that you want to see your organization adopt. So, my advice would be to start small and build momentum on your successes. Ideally, your first Brownfield project should be something simple and quantifiable. So if any other people in your organization are nervous about React Native or have concerns about its stability, you can kind of put those fears to rest by knocking it out of the ballpark in something simple. Okay, so up until now, I've been talking about whether you should actually do a Brownfield React Native integration. So let's just say that you've thought about it and you said, yeah, this is the right thing for me and my organization. How do I go about doing this? Well, in order to answer this question, I have open sourced a Brownfield React Native example application. And this example application is based on some work that I did for one of my clients in San Francisco. And this client is KeepSafe. KeepSafe is a privacy startup. They provide a suite of applications that keep your information private online. Their most famous application is a private photos app. This app allows you to store photos outside of the Android and iOS photos applications privately and securely. They operate on a freemium business model, which means that the application is free for everyone to use, but if you want to use certain features, you have to sign up for a subscription. So what KeepSafe wanted to do is they wanted to use React Native to power the subscription upsell screens, and they wanted to be able to use code push to ship new experiments without submitting a new app to the app stores. So The example app that I'm going to show you here is open source and it's available up on my GitHub. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a video of this example application in action, and then we're going to go through what parts of this application are native, what parts are React Native, and how this is structured. So again, remember, this is meant to be a subscription upsell screen. So what does this example app need to do, regardless of if we are using React Native or not? Well, we want to be able to display a particular upsell screen when a user does something in the native app. So the user's account has maybe expired, they've come back into the application, we want to display a dialog then. Maybe the user taps on a button associated with a premium feature. We want to be able to display a dialog in that case. We also want to be able to get a list of all of the experiments screens exposed to the application at runtime so that we can map them to these interactions. So what parts of this demo are actually being powered by React Native? The white screen with the Show Promotion button is all native code. On iOS, when you tap the Show Promotion button, what we do is we present a view controller that contains all of the code that's hosting React Native and integrates it into the application. Within the React Native screen, which is the purple and blue screen that just so happens to match the color scheme of this room, we handle all of the interactions like making a purchase or closing the dialog, and they are going to result in events that are going to be sent over to the native Brownfield app, and is going to be handled there. So what does this integration need to be able to do at a high level? Well, we need a way to send and receive events between React Native and native code, and we need a way to pass data in and out of React Native. How do we do this? Well, there are a number of different ways to bridge native components. The Facebook docs have an excellent collection of examples for this. But I decided to use a third-party library that was developed by some engineers who were working on the Brownfield integration at Pinterest called React Native Event Bridge. I'm going to explain why I use this library later on in my presentation, but basically it simplifies the process of bridging React Native events to native code in an existing application. The authors of this library are two engineers, Michael and Tormey, who you can follow on Pinterest. I'd like to say thank you to them and Pinterest Engineering for providing this library. Okay, so let's go back to the application and look at this from the point of view of the user. What happens when I click Purchase? So when I click Purchase, React Native emits an event in JavaScript with an SKU. So for those of you who've never worked in commerce, an SKU is a unique identifier that maps an item to an inventory system. Events are strings defined in both JavaScript and native. Native code has event handlers that hook into the existing payment system. So this is the payment system in the native app, not one that's installed by an NPM module. And it's going to basically then trigger Apple Pay or whatever it is that we want to do with the data payload that we've sent over the bridge. So let's go back to our example again and enumerate the events that are actually taking place here. Clicking the Close button triggers an event. Clicking the Purchase button, that's also triggering an event. So what events are being emitted? So Dismiss screen tells the native navigation system, the system that exists outside of React Native, to dismiss the screen hosting the React Native integration. And Purchase item tells the native purchase system to make a purchase with the SKU that we pass over the bridge. So the native side and React Native communicate through the event bridge that's being wrapped with this third-party library. The native side, in this particular example, is a view controller, and it has basically some code for processing events and routing them to the appropriate subsystems in the native application. React Native, when you interact with the screen by hitting the Close button or hitting the Purchase button, will send strings with JavaScript objects associated with them over the bridge, and these strings and objects will be processed by the native code. When the application starts up, it reads a JSON file that contains a list of all of these screens. This JSON file is generated when you build the application or run a script. When you click on the Show Promotion dialog, we instantiate the React Native bridge, and we pass in a string and a configuration file which will map to the screen that's going to be displayed and the default props that are going to be used to power that screen. So what does a purchase event look like in JavaScript? So in the GitHub repository that I linked earlier, there is a object with a series of strings in it. Dismiss screen and purchase item are the two that we're going to be focusing on. The actual screen that gets displayed looks just like a normal React native component. If we zoomed into the actual purchase function, we'll see here that we're using EventBridge. EventBridge is provided by React Native EventBridge, and we're passing it in a string and an optional dictionary that contains any data that we want to pass over the bridge. So what does a purchase event look like in native code? So once again, we have a series of const values, and so we have in ORM events a dismiss screen string and a purchase item string. In the React Native view controller that's hosting this, we have a function that sets up all of the events. What this is doing is it's basically associating a callback function with a particular string. And when the bridge sends over the event, we are going to basically process these events here. The native code that handles the purchase item event looks like this. The UI alert controller example here would obviously actually hook into the Apple Pay system in a real-world application like this. So what does all of this look like in JavaScript? Let's go through this from the beginning. So when we instantiate the React Native view controller, it sets up the bridge, and it instantiates it with this thing that's an entry point. In the entry point in our render function, we pass in some props. These props come over the bridge from React Native, and they'll contain basically a screen that we want to display, right? So this might be one of the two different variations on the upsell dialog that I showed in the example video, and it will contain some props. Those props might be an SKU, a localized price. The localizing of the price would probably happen in the native iOS application based on some stuff that we get back from the iTunes store. The getScreen function looks like this. It basically checks to see if the screen is present in this configuration file, and then if it is, it will return the screen with the props that you've passed in. If it's not, it will display a not found screen so that the customer can contact customer support and let them know that this has happened, and we can maybe fire off some analytics events or something like that to indicate this. Once again, here is where we enumerate all the events that this JavaScript bundle can support. This is, again, like what the upsell screens look like. Each upsell screen, as I mentioned earlier, has a default configuration that gets written into the JSON file that's exposed to the native application when it starts up. The reason why we do this is, in this particular example, KeepSafe wanted to localize their prices across a variety of different regions, and this localization would come back from iTunes when we passed in the SKU to it. So what happens when React Native displays a screen? So the React Native view controller hosts React Native in native code, and it starts it with the props based on the config.js file that's associated with those screens. The entry point is index.js. This is going to call getScreen and retrieve the actual screen that's going to be rendered. Native code has event handlers that hook into the existing native system that handles Apple Pay, navigation, etc. What does this all look like in native code? So for iOS, the entry point into any iOS application is appdelegate.swift. What we're doing here is we are wiring up the home screen. This is the native code that's going to show the Show Promotion button. When you tap on the Show Promotion button, it instantiates React Native View Controller, and all of our integration into React Native lives here. And what we're doing here is we're just setting up some generic event handlers to handle dismissing the screen and the purchase events. This file, reactnative.h, is how we represent these events in Objective-C. React Native Host Controller is something that we, like I wrote, to manage adding and removing events from the event bus. And React Native constants.swift is just a collection of string constants associated with this process. React Native Screen Manager.swift is something that I wrote to simulate an A/B test. It basically loads up the list of all screens at runtime and randomly selects one when you click on the show screen button. So that covers the technical architecture, but that's only one piece of the equation. How do I apply this architecture, and what kind of development process would I use within an organization that's trying to do brownfield React Native development? Well, I created this flowchart that I'm going to walk you through to explain this process. But what I want you to imagine is that we're working at a company, and maybe Torben is the Android expert at this company, and Michael is the iOS expert, and I am the React Native engineer who is working on this sprint. So the process would start off, we review the mocks that have been designed by the designer and the product manager, and the thing that we're looking for here is, do we need to actually make any additional native changes to these mocks? If we do, what will happen is me, Torben, and Michael will agree on some stub events, and Torben and Michael will go off and implement the native code that's needed to support this release, and I'll continue on my merry way implementing all of the React Native stuff that I can and putting in place the mock events that I've agreed upon. After a while, we meet up with the designers and PMs, and we review the final product, and we test it. If there's problems with the Android implementation or the iOS implementation, we fix that, and we keep iterating until we're ready, we're happy with the result. We then go and we integrate this back into the application, and at this point, we need to actually see if there's any native changes being made. So as you know, code push doesn't allow for over-the-air updates for native changes. So if native changes are required, we need to wait until the next release train goes out the door and we ship a new iOS or Android application. If there is no native changes, we can code push immediately to the public, and we can ramp up with whatever policy you like. So why do we use React Native Event Bridge? So one thing you might be asking yourself is, well, I've read the docs on wrapping native modules, and this looks very different from that. Well, originally when we developed this project, we actually wanted to be able to have external engineers who did not have access to the native keep-safe code be able to work on this application. In fact, we actually used Snack from Expo to get back work from these engineers, and we had a script that would integrate that work into the React Native application. So if you've ever worked on a lot of native applications, even getting Carthage or CocoaPods set up and building and installing on your laptop can take an hour or two of work. You also may not be comfortable handing over all of your IP to some random third-party engineer. So the reason why we use React Native Event Bridge is we wanted to have engineers who are maybe coming from a web background or a non-native background be able to work on screens without actually having access to any of the underlying native technology or even having to understand why that works. Again, that's not the only way that you could implement a brownfield React Native application, but this was part of the use case and the challenge that we had with this particular case. So as I said before, this is not the only way to do a brownfield React Native integration. One set of engineers that have been doing really, really great work on this is the engineers over at Artsy. They have open sourced their entire brownfield React Native application, and they've written a number of really, really, really high quality blog posts that I highly recommend you checking out. Their GitHub is absolutely amazing, and their blog posts are really worth reading. I can't recommend them enough. Ortha is a fantastic engineer working at Artsy. He also maintains a number of other projects that are super relevant to mobile engineers. I highly recommend you follow him on GitHub. He's an awesome guy. Pinterest have done some presentations and writing on their brownfield React Native integration. One article that's worth reading is Supporting React Native at Pinterest by Vivian Q. And Torben, he recently gave a presentation at DroidCon Berlin called Leveraging Your Android Knowledge to Boost Your Team's Velocity with React Native. The examples that I've given today have been very iOS focused due to the time constraints of this talk. Torben's talk is all from an Android user's perspective, and he goes into a lot of technical details that I didn't go into today, and he will talk about this from an Android developer's perspective. So I just want to say thank you to Torben and Michael once again. You can follow them on Twitter here. If you want to follow me, I'm also on Twitter at htormey. You can also read my Medium blog at launchdoor.com. And if you have any questions or if you're interested in React Native training or consulting, shoot me an email. Last but not least, I want to say thank you so much to all the folks at Callstack. You guys are absolutely amazing. You've done a fantastic job at this conference. It's my first time speaking here. Hopefully you'll be back again next year. And I want to say thank you to Keep Safe, Michael, Torben, and Rob. Thank you very much, everyone.